The sun beat down on the valley floor as the SEAL team moved in a tight formation, their boots pressing into the dry, cracked earth with each cautious step. The canyon walls rose like jagged blades of stone on either side, towering so high they swallowed the sky and left only a thin ribbon of blue above. Every man kept his weapon ready, eyes darting to the ridges and shadows that stretched across the cliffs. The silence was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a hunter waiting for prey, and every veteran among them felt it deep in his gut. The heat shimmered off the rocks, and even the wind refused to move, as though the valley itself was holding its breath. Each step forward carried the weight of tension, and yet the mission demanded progress, so they pressed on despite the unease that gnawed at them. The team leader raised his hand, stopping the column for a brief moment. He studied the ridges above, scanning every ledge and crack with the cold patience of a man who had seen too many ambushes to ignore the feeling in his chest. His men crouched low, rifles angled upward, while sweat slid down their faces, mixing with the dust that clung to their skin. The stillness grew heavier, and every sound of boots shifting or gear clicking seemed to echo too loudly against the canyon walls. For a fleeting instant it felt as though the rocks themselves were watching, waiting for the signal to strike. The SEALs moved again, this time tighter than before, shadows flickering across their eyes as the sun shifted overhead. The point man lifted his rifle, scanning each rise of stone, each ledge that could hide a shooter, but nothing stirred, nothing gave away the danger. The silence pressed deeper like a weight on the chest, an invisible hand closing tighter with each passing step. One soldier muttered under his breath that the place felt wrong, but his words were swallowed by the still air. Another checked his radio instinctively, though no message had come through in hours, and the static only deepened the sense of isolation. The canyon narrowed further until the walls seemed close enough to crush them in place. The men could feel their nerves pulling tighter with every second. They were trapped in a passage with no room to maneuver and no way to retreat if something happened. And then, just as the team leader raised his hand again, the silence shattered in a storm of gunfire, and the men realized too late that they had walked into a death trap. Gunfire poured down from the cliffs in a torrent of steel and fire, cutting into the valley floor with deadly precision. The enemy had been waiting hidden in carved nests of rock, their weapons already trained on the passage where the SEALs now lay exposed. The air was ripped apart by the roar of heavy machine guns, and the sharp crack of rifles echoing against the canyon walls like thunder in a storm. Dust and shards of stone erupted around the men as bullets chewed through the ground and ricocheted from the jagged rock around them. The SEALs dove for cover, but the valley offered little more than scattered stones, too small to shield them from the relentless onslaught. One man pressed against a shallow outcrop, feeling rounds slam into the rock inches from his head. Another threw himself flat into the dirt, pressing his body low while fragments of shattered stone cut into his arms and face. Every attempt to rise or crawl was answered with an immediate burst of fire that drove them back into the ground. The cliffs above were alive with muzzle flashes and shadows of fighters moving like phantoms through their positions. It was clear that this was not a random attack but a carefully laid trap, and the SEALs were caught in the center of it. The team leader shouted for suppression fire, and the men responded with bursts from their rifles. Tracer rounds streaked upward, but the angle was wrong and the cover was too strong. The enemy had chosen their positions with precision. Rounds bounced harmlessly off the stone or disappeared into the cracks, while the enemy fire only grew heavier. A machine gun on the northern ridge pinned them hardest, its endless stream of rounds tearing the ground in front of their positions. The SEALs tried to reposition to gain an angle, but every move was met with more fire, pinning them in place again and again. Sweat mixed with dirt and blood as the men clung to their fragile cover, breathing hard and steadying their nerves. Training told them to remain calm, to think through the storm, but the volume of fire left no room for mistakes. Each man knew in silence what none dared to say aloud: the enemy had them locked in a perfect kill zone. Minutes dragged like hours, and the pressure of the ambush weighed heavier with each passing breath. And as the machine guns continued to roar above, the men realized they were not facing survival but the edge of certain death. The team leader pressed his radio hard against his ear, trying to call in support, but the only sound that came back was static, broken and cruel. He switched frequencies, hoping for another channel, but the silence never changed. The enemy had jammed their signals, cutting them off from every lifeline. The reality hit with the weight of stone. They were alone in this canyon, and no one even knew they were under fire. His men looked to him for direction, their faces streaked with dirt, sweat, and fear, though their hands stayed firm on their rifles. They were trained for chaos, trained for ambush, but training could not erase the truth that survival was slipping away minute by minute. Bullets kept tearing the ground and ricocheting off stone, forcing them lower into the dust. One SEAL crawled to reposition, but a crack from above sent a round inches past his helmet, pinning him flat before he could even lift his head. Another man gritted his teeth as shards of rock cut into his arms, yet he refused to move or cry out. The leader signaled with hand gestures for the team to conserve ammunition, to fire only when a target was certain. But targets were shadows hidden deep in the rocks, firing from cover too strong to breach from the valley floor. The men waited, pressed against stone that offered little comfort, listening to the endless roar of guns above. Every heartbeat pounded louder, every second stretched longer, as if time itself slowed to mock their helplessness. The silence between bursts of fire was even worse, for in those pauses they could hear the enemy shouting in their own language, preparing to push closer. Each man could picture the wave of fighters advancing from the cliffs, closing the trap even tighter around them. The team leader clenched his jaw, knowing he had no air support, no artillery, no reinforcements, and no way out but forward. A single thought pressed into every mind with the sharpness of a blade: this might be the end. Yet not one of them gave in to panic. They gripped their rifles tighter, as if sheer will could change the odds. Eyes locked with one another in silent understanding, they would fight until the last bullet was spent. Still deep inside each man the question burned with growing fire: who would be the first to fall? And as the shouts of the enemy grew louder from the cliffs, the SEALs braced for the final push that seemed ready to break upon them. High above the valley, where the sun lit the jagged ridges, a lone figure lay pressed flat against the stone, his rifle balanced steady across a pack that had been wedged into the rock. He had been there for days, watching the cliffs and the paths of the fighters who used the terrain as their fortress, and he knew the valley below was a place of certain death for anyone who walked into it. The SEALs did not know him, and he was not part of their mission. He was not even supposed to be there, but he had his reasons for staying hidden in the mountains and watching the movement of the enemy. Through his scope he had tracked their preparations, their weapons, their supply lines, and the way they used the high ground like a blade against anyone who dared pass beneath. Now as he looked down through the swirling dust, he saw the SEALs pinned in the kill zone, exactly as he had feared would happen, and he understood that if he did not act, none of them would leave that place alive. He adjusted his position slowly, every movement controlled, every breath measured against the rhythm of his heartbeat. The stone beneath him was hot from the sun, the wind was thin and dry, but his mind was cold, steady, focused on the task before him. He had studied the faces of the gunners and the commanders who barked orders from the shadows of the cliffs, and he knew who to strike first. His gloved finger rested on the trigger as he let out a breath and pressed his cheek tighter against the stock of his rifle. Through the scope he could see the enemy laughing, confident in their trap, and he felt the weight of decision settle firmly into his chest. Below, the SEALs were still trapped in the dirt, the ground erupting around them with every burst of fire and the echoes of war filling the canyon like thunder. The hidden figure knew their time was running out, and that hesitation meant death for all of them. The choice was not whether to fire, but when to begin the storm that would change the battle. He inhaled once more, holding the breath steady as the crosshairs settled over the first target, a machine gunner whose weapon spat fire without end into the valley. And in that final second before his finger pulled back, he knew the silence of the canyon was about to break in a way that neither friend nor foe expected. The shot cracked through the canyon like lightning, splitting the sky, a sound so sharp it cut through the thunder of machine guns and the chaos below. The enemy gunner who had poured endless fire into the SEAL's chest arched back and fell from his nest, his weapon tumbling silent into the rocks. For the briefest moment the valley froze, caught between disbelief and confusion, as though time itself had stumbled in shock. The SEALs pressed into the dirt, looked up bewildered, not knowing where the shot had come from and not daring to believe what it might mean. Then the second shot came, swift, precise, merciless, and another figure slumped forward lifeless, his body sliding across the ledge before crashing into the dust below. The men below could hardly register what was happening, their ears ringing with the echoes of each deadly crack. But they knew instinctively that someone unseen had entered the fight, and that someone was not on the side of the enemy. The air felt charged with a new kind of energy, hope flickering where only despair had lived a heartbeat before. Through the dust and haze the SEALs could see gaps forming in the storm of fire as enemy weapons fell silent one by one. Yet they did not know how many more shots would come or how long this phantom ally could hold against so many enemies. Up on the ridge, the sniper remained motionless, his breathing calm, his movements mechanical as he worked the bolt and sighted the next target. Every pull of the trigger was followed by a flash, a crack, and the fall of another enemy who never even knew from where death had arrived. He aimed not at random but with cold precision, striking first the heaviest guns, then the spotters, then the leaders whose shouts had driven the ambush. Each shot was like a scalpel carving away the strength of the force that had trapped the SEALs below. And with each body that dropped, the panic among the attackers grew louder, breaking the rhythm of their perfect trap. The SEALs exchanged glances, their weapons tightening in their grip as they began to return fire in bursts timed with the silence created by the hidden sniper. For the first time since the ambush began, they could move with intent, crawling to better cover and lifting their heads without certain death. Still, no one could see the savior above, and no one could guess how long his rifle would keep speaking. And as the echoes of another shot rolled across the stone, the SEALs felt the tide turning but wondered what storm was still yet to come. The sniper's rhythm never faltered, his rifle rising and falling with the steady breath of a man who had lived his life in the shadows of war. Each shot cut through the roar of battle, and with every trigger pull another enemy collapsed, either dropping from the ridges or slumping into the dust of the cliffs. The attackers who had been confident a moment before now scrambled like prey caught in the open, their perfect ambush unraveling under the weight of precision they could not see or answer. Their voices rose in panic as leaders shouted for positions to be held, but fear had already cracked their resolve. The machine guns that once pinned the SEALs had fallen silent one by one, leaving only fragments of fire from scattered rifles, unable to control the canyon anymore. The SEALs felt the shift like a surge of electricity in their blood. Their training told them to seize momentum, and they did without hesitation. They crawled from the shallow cover they had dug into, pushing forward in short bursts, firing into the cliffs whenever a shadow appeared. Their rounds no longer vanished uselessly against stone, but now struck enemy fighters who had been forced from their positions by the unseen marksman. Confidence returned to their movements, though caution never left their eyes, and they pressed harder into the fight, knowing survival had been given back to them for a reason. One SEAL shouted above the chaos that they had a guardian somewhere in the rocks, but no one had time to answer. The enemy tried to regroup, attempting to shift their fire and circle from the rear, but the sniper adjusted faster than they could move. His scope found the men carrying heavier weapons first, and his bullets cut them down before they even reached cover. Then he struck at the commanders whose hand signals directed the flow of the ambush, leaving the rest of the force without leadership and without order. Every crack of his rifle drove panic deeper into the enemy lines, scattering them like leaves caught in a sudden storm. The valley that had moments ago been a cage of death was now turning into a graveyard for those who had built the trap. Still, the SEALs knew victory was not yet in their hands, for the enemy force was larger than what they could see, and reinforcements were already moving closer through the mountains. Dust clouds on the ridges signaled more fighters closing in waves that would soon fill the valley again. The sniper could not kill them all, and the SEALs could not hold forever. And as the echoes of fresh voices carried on the wind, the men realized the battle had only begun to change, not to end. The sound of boots striking rock carried across the canyon as enemy reinforcements surged toward the fight, their voices rising like a storm behind the cliffs. The SEALs caught glimpses of movement on the ridges and knew that the first ambush had only been the beginning. A second wave was already pressing down on them. The snipers' shots rang out again, sharp and merciless, striking men as they scrambled into firing positions, but for every one that fell another appeared from the dust. The enemy had numbers on their side, and numbers alone could tilt the balance back into their favor. The machine guns had been silenced, yet rifles still cracked from hidden angles, forcing the SEALs to fight for every inch they gained. The team leader barked orders through hand signals, his men spreading in tighter formation as they pushed toward a cluster of boulders that offered more cover. Rounds slammed into the stone, sparking fragments into the air as they moved, but the sniper above cut down anyone who pressed too close. Even with his cover fire, the SEALs knew the fight was far from under control. They could feel it in the way the enemy pressed forward without fear of losses. Their ambush had been broken, but not their determination, and they were willing to throw bodies into the canyon until the Americans were crushed. Each SEAL checked ammunition, quickly realizing that their magazines were running lower than they wanted, and there would be no resupply, no drop, no relief. The sniper shifted his aim from one ridge to another, his rifle spitting death at a pace that seemed impossible for one man alone. Through the scope, he tracked the reinforcements, trying to coordinate from the rear, cutting down anyone who raised a hand to direct movement. Still, he could see more shadows pouring in from behind the rocks, and he knew the tide could not be held forever by his rifle alone. He steadied his breathing, blocking out the chaos below, focusing only on the next target, the next shot, the next life to erase from the battlefield. His mission was no longer his own, it was survival for the men below, and he could not stop even for a moment. The SEALs pressed harder, laying down bursts of fire, pushing through the smoke and dust as they clawed for control of the canyon. But the reinforcements were closing fast, and the valley was tightening around them again, just as it had when the first ambush began. And as the echoes of new gunfire rolled down the cliffs, the men realized the battle was entering its most brutal stage, and the outcome was still far from certain. The sniper slid along the jagged ridge, his body hugging the stone as he found a new angle on the valley below. From this perch, he could see the fresh wave of fighters spilling into the canyon, their rifles raised, their shouts carrying across the wind like a promise of slaughter. He steadied his rifle against the rock, sighting down the scope at the men who drove the reinforcements forward, cutting them down with the same precision that had shattered the first ambush. Every pull of the trigger echoed like a hammer strike in the canyon, sending bodies crashing from ledges and silencing weapons that had just opened fire. Yet for every man he felled, another pushed forward, and the stream of enemies showed no sign of ending. Below, the SEALs felt the rhythm of his cover fire, and they moved with it like dancers following the beat of a hidden drum. Each shot from above created a moment of silence, and in that moment the SEALs surged forward, firing bursts of their own, carving paths through the chaos. The coordination was unspoken but flawless, as though they had trained together for years, though the sniper remained only a ghost somewhere in the rocks. The enemy began to falter again, confusion spreading as men dropped and orders went unanswered. Still, their numbers drove them forward, and the pressure never fully broke. The team leader signaled for his men to push toward higher ground, a slope that rose to the right side of the canyon. It was a gamble, but one they had to take. If they stayed pinned in the valley floor, they would be buried beneath sheer numbers. The SEALs rose in short bursts, covering each other as they climbed the slope, their weapons spitting fire with each step. Bullets whipped past them, striking stone so close the fragments cut into their skin, but they pressed forward, teeth clenched, eyes locked on survival. Above, the sniper shifted once more, laying down fire that cleared their path, slicing through the shooters who tried to pin the team from the ridges. Sweat stung their eyes, muscles screamed from the climb, yet still they pressed upward because retreat was death and hesitation was worse. The canyon thundered with overlapping cracks, rifles shouting from below, and the sniper answering from above in a deadly rhythm that echoed like a storm. And as the SEALs neared the top of the slope, hearts pounding, lungs burning, they saw the dark shapes of yet another enemy wave waiting just beyond the crest. The SEALs reached the crest of the slope, their rifles ready, their bodies drained yet fueled by the last reserves of adrenaline that war always demands. On the ridge above them, the enemy wave rose like a wall of shadows, rifles gleaming, eyes burning with determination to finish what the ambush had begun. For one breath, both sides locked eyes across the stone, a heartbeat of silence in a canyon that had been roaring with gunfire since the first trap was sprung. Then the valley exploded once more, the enemy charging down the slope, unleashing a storm of rounds that tore across the rocks where the SEALs clung for survival. The men fought back with every bullet they had left, each shot deliberate, each burst fired with the desperation of warriors who knew there could be no retreat. Above them, the sniper worked with the same unshakable rhythm, his scope finding targets faster than eyes could blink. He struck the leaders first, then the gunners, then the flankers who tried to circle behind the SEALs, every crack of his rifle slowing the charge and breaking its edge. Bodies tumbled across the rocks, weapons clattered lifeless to the ground, yet still the wave pressed forward with sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the line. The SEALs fought like men possessed, rifles spitting their last rounds, knives drawn when magazines ran dry, fists clenched when knives broke in the struggle. Every man knew that this final push would decide whether they lived or whether the canyon became their grave. The battle raged in chaos, dust, smoke, blood, and stone mixing into one unbroken storm. Yet slowly the tide began to shift, the rhythm of the sniper's fire tearing holes in the attack, the SEALs filling each gap with steel and willpower. Step by step the enemy faltered, their shouts turning to cries of fear as the ground was littered with their fallen comrades. The charge slowed, then broke, men scattering back across the rocks, desperate to escape the unseen death that had stalked them from above. The valley fell into a heavy silence broken only by the ringing in the ears of the survivors and the crackle of cooling weapons. The seals pulled themselves together, bloodied, exhausted but alive, their eyes lifting toward the ridges where the sniper had saved them again and again. They searched for movement, a shadow, a sign of the man who had stood between them and certain death. But the rocks were empty, the figure gone, as if he had never been there at all, leaving only the echoes of his shots to haunt the canyon. And as the seals began their long extraction through the mountains, each man carried the same unspoken thought: without that hidden marksman, none of them would have walked away alive.